good evening, depending on where you're joining from today. My name is Eric Kimberling, here for our weekly live stream, and I am here with Kyler Cheatham, who's my podcast host and our global marketing director here at Third Stage Consulting. Kyler, thanks for being here today.
Thanks for having me. Always excited to jump on a live stream.
Absolutely. This is going to be a fun one in particular, partly because I think this is probably yours and my favorite topic. I'm speaking for myself, really. I don't know about you, but I'm just kind of assuming maybe you love this topic as much as I do.
I do.
Um,
Yes.
I guess we'll find out how much you love it here as we get talking about it. But thank you for the audience for being here today, too. We're going to talk today about organizational change management. We're going to take questions and answers from the audience about change management. We've got some starting point questions to sort of kick off the conversation and set the context of sort of what is change management, what are the most important parts of it, what are the biggest risks, that sort of thing. But really the intent of these live streams is to get your feedback and your questions. So we're streaming onto LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. So if you're on any of those platforms watching live, we encourage you to jump in with any questions at any point along the way. And just to sort of warm things up and just to get to know the audience a little bit, if you could, just drop in the chat where you're joining from today. What city and country are you in? We always love to see where in the world everyone is joining from today on the various platforms we're streaming to. And we'll come back to that here in a second, just so we can all see who the global audience is here. So today's topic, organizational change management. We use this live production, this live stream will be used in our weekly Transformation Ground Control podcast, which will be released a week from tomorrow. So every Wednesday we have new episodes. Every Tuesday we do these live streams, which then get produced as part of the overall episode a week later. So you get to be part of the live production of our podcast. So thank you for being part of that. So to set the context, I guess to start, today's conversation is going to focus on, as I mentioned, organizational change management. Why is it so important? What is it? What are the things to think about? What are some of the challenges within the context of a digital transformation? So, so I guess, Kyler, you've got some questions to get things started. Maybe we could start there and then jump in with audience questions as we continue the conversation here.
Absolutely, definitely. And as a reminder, with all of our live streams, go ahead and drop your questions, join the conversation in whatever platform you're watching on. We can see them right here on our platform and always addressing all of your questions as well. So thanks for joining. And so, Eric, I want to kind of jump in as you started your career in organizational change management. And have really held it as one of the keys to transformation success. So can you give us a definition of organizational change management to kind of set the foundation of this conversation?
Yeah. And that's a great question because so many people use the term pretty loosely. It's a pretty vague term that doesn't really tell you a lot about what it really means, which is part of what drives me crazy about modern change management. But nevertheless, organizational change management, I think probably the simplest way to categorize it or to define it is that it's any activity or any effort that helps people transition through the change that they're going through.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, technology-focused people will think that must mean training and communications, just training on how to use the new system, communicating things about the new system. And that is certainly part of it, but that's just a small subset of the overall change management dimension, if you will. So it's everything from the early stages of getting people involved in a project. It's how people's jobs are going to change and helping define how the jobs are going to change, helping people understand and be a part of the process changes, helping them understand the new technology, helping them understand what their new accountability metrics and overall responsibilities, what that might look like. So there's a lot to it, but basically, if I were just to summarize it in one sentence, it's any activity that helps migrate the human or the people side of an organization to the future state.
Absolutely. And did you see that little question on the side that said most change managers can't describe what they do without using the word change? Is that why you didn't use the word change in there?
Did I avoid using it? I did actually
You did. Yeah.
Normally I do say the word change.
Yeah.
So I'm glad I just coincidentally did not say change, particularly for our audience member here. And actually, while we're doing that, before, not to interrupt you, but why don't we? I thought maybe we could show some of the. If I can do it, it's not letting me do it. You don't see the chat on the screen, do you?
For some reason, it's just saying new comments there. If you select the chat tab, But otherwise, we can kind of just talk through where we have some international audience joining us from today because there's a lot.
Yeah, there's a lot joining here today. We've got uh, Gilbert from Malta, Australia, Vinud from India. We have someone from Heilbronn, Germany, Leeds, UK, Houston, Texas, Egypt, KSA, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Germany, Mexico, UK,
Mhm.
just to name a few. Another from Saudi Arabia, from Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. So a lot of global audience here today from all over the world. So thank you for being here. Um, and the comment that you had, I just had it right here. It is a pretty interesting and funny comment. Most change managers can't describe what they do without using the word change. So that's actually a good. I've never really thought of that before. Like,
Mhm.
if you should be able to describe change management, I suppose, without using the word change and just describing, what it is you're doing. And I think that helps. It helps clarify the point for sure.
Absolutely, and I think that change is such an intangible thing, and it can really surface a lot of emotional reactions around it too. Fear, which we see a lot of resistance come from. So when we talk about a change management initiative when it comes to a digital transformation, can you kind of talk about the attachment between the two? Digital transformation, technology implementation, upgrade, anything with a new technology, and the relationship to organizational change management.
Yeah, it's a great question, and sort of a great foundational
Mhm.
context setting for change management. And anytime you deploy any sort of technology, even if it's a relatively simple upgrade, which it never is simple, but let's just say you're just doing an upgrade from vendor A to the latest version of vendor A's software. Even that, using the same solution but an upgraded version, usually that has a lot more significant impacts to the organization than people think. And it's not just how to use the system. It's not just new transactions or keystrokes or functions or capabilities within the system that people have to get used to. Usually it's that people's jobs materially change, their
Mhm.
responsibilities materially change as a result of the technology, or at least they should materially change if you want to get the value out of the technology. Now, if all you're really trying to do is just put in new technology, you really
Mhm.
don't care about efficiency, you don't care about improving performance or increasing business value. If it's more of a necessity, if you will, then I suppose change management isn't as material. But I would argue that that's not a recipe for success if you do go down that path. So any sort of technology initiative is going to have a material impact to an organization, in my opinion. And organizations need to have that clear vision of what that change is going to be and how they're going to help people get there.
Absolutely. And I think we'll kind of dive into the measurement after we get through kind of some of our definitions. But within digital transformation, when should change management be included?
Well, I always say that I've never met a client who has said that they started their change management too early and they regret doing that. Or if they could go back, they would have started their change management a little bit later, or they would have held off on the change management stuff. I've yet to meet a client that has said that. I also have yet, by the way, to meet a client that says that they wish they would have invested less time and focus on change
Right.
management and that they spent too little time on change management. In contrary, it's usually the opposite. Even in cases where they hire third stage to help with the change management, even in those cases, it's still usually never enough. I mean, I guess when you think of it, you can never start early enough, and you can never really do enough change management. And again, the reason is because it is such a big impact, and it's so distracting oftentimes to focus on the technology stuff. The technology stuff usually is a big distraction. It's a big time and resource suck. So what ends up happening is you end up neglecting the organizational and human side of it. So my view of change management is that you should absolutely do it as soon as possible. And in a perfect world, in an ideal state, you would do it even before you've really nailed down and gotten sign off on your implementation plan.
Mhm.
Reason being that you can't realistically know how fast or how quickly you can deploy new technology effectively without fully understanding what your change strategy is. And even prior to that, understanding what the impacts of the organization are and how material or how big of a change it's going to be and who's going to be affected the most. Only by doing that sort of upfront assessment can you then define a change strategy and change management plan that really takes into consideration the things that are unique to you as an organization. And only by having that view of the impact of the organization and what your change strategy and plan is, only then can you have a realistic view of what the overall plan is going to be. Because
Mhm.
usually change management is something that's going to take you longer than deploying technology. It's a lot easier and faster to deploy technology than it is to deploy technology that gets used by your business, gets embedded within your organization. So those are two very different things. And so you have to really have that clarity up front, or else you're flying blind going into your implementation. And too many organizations sort of draw a line in the sand that says,
Mhm.
okay, vendor says it's going to take 18 months to deploy technology, which is probably realistic. Vendor probably can deploy technology in 18 months. But the problem is, can your organization adapt to and digest those changes and adjust to that new future state in 18 months? And most organizations in that example, the answer is no. So to answer your question, start as soon as you can, because the sooner you do that upfront organizational assessment, the sooner you have a clear change strategy and plan, the more effective you're going to be in the overall implementation.
Yeah, and the more risk I think you mitigate when you have the awareness of the power of change management. And I think that's the piece that many people don't understand is it really has the power to either create a failure when it comes to an implementation or a huge disruption within business operations because of things like misperception, resistance, the virality of communication within an organization that might not be correct. So understanding what that impact could have, I think, is so important. So let's talk a little bit about that software selection phase. Is change management important when you are selecting a software?
It is, not only as part of your decision, but as I mentioned a moment ago, it's also part of your planning process, or it should be part of your
Mhm.
planning process. So since I already mentioned the planning process, let's come back to the software decision part of your
Mhm.
question. And that is that, when you're choosing software and you're evaluating software, it's really important to do a couple things. One is to involve people in the process. So by involving people in the software selection, you're sort of maybe unintentionally addressing some of the change management issues that organizations face, which is people feel like they don't have control of the changes. And when people feel
Mhm.
like they have control, one way to help people feel like they have control is to involve them in the changes. And certainly, helping make a decision around software and the appropriate technology for your organization is one way to do that. Um, the other thing too is, though, when you get into the decision itself, a lot of organizations focus so much on features and functions, sort of their checklist of things they think they want technology to do, but they don't think about the cultural impact that that particular technology might have. And so I'll give you an example. If you're a really, say you're a large organization, you're a multinational global organization, and you're trying to sort of standardize and scale your operations, and you're trying to take disparate processes and disparate systems, and you're trying to create sort of a common platform, a common target operating model, common way of doing business across the world. But then you go deploy a product like, say, Microsoft Dynamics. And I'm just picking on a couple of vendors that I could have put in a number of different vendors in
Mhm.
these examples. So don't put too much stock in this. But let's just say you go to deploy Microsoft Dynamics in that
Mhm.
situation. Well, Microsoft Dynamics, the cultural impact of that is Microsoft Dynamics is a super flexible product that's sort of meant to be tailored, and it is meant to adjust to different situations. And that may not align with that culture you're trying to create or that future state that you're trying to create. Whereas something like an SAP that's more standardized, it's more rigid, it's meant to drive more common business processes than other systems. SAP might be a better fit in that case. And so that might better align with the culture fit that you're going for.
Mhm.
Or on the flip side, if you're a very entrepreneurial organization, you're very nimble, you're constantly changing, you're constantly improving, then SAP might be too standard for you. It might be too rigid, whereas a
Mhm.
Microsoft Dynamics might be more flexible. And again, there's a million different technologies out there. I just happen to pick those two because they're well known. But that's the way that organizations oftentimes have to look at some of those intangible qualitative factors when selecting software from a change management perspective.
Absolutely. And I want to get to change management and company culture, but let's pull up some of these really great questions we're getting from the audience first.
Sure.
So, yeah, so I So we have one here. Is there any official certification industry recognized that one can do for change management? I think this is a really good question specifically for you, since you have spent your career in kind of this space. So what would you say to those types of certifications?
Yeah. So one of the more common um, and effective certifications that has evolved in the last decade or so has been ProSci. So getting ProSci certified is one way to sort of build up your toolkit or your knowledge base of change management. There's also other change programs or change schools of thought out there like Cotter,
Mhm.
Kotter. He's a I think he's a professor, and he created sort of a change management framework that's still referred to today. It's something he developed a couple of decades ago. But there's a couple different frameworks and training courses you can do like that. ProSci has really become sort of the standard.
Mhm.
But I always encourage people to think not just about change
Right.
management directly and not just think of change management as a siloed, standalone
Mhm.
function that you need to get certified in or get training in, but also think about the other things that are going to help you navigate change. And that could be things like, Lean Six Sigma, for example. If you know Lean Six Sigma, some of the best change management consultants I know aren't just good at, having ProSci certification and knowing sort of the change management stuff, but they also understand the operational stuff. They understand the
Mhm.
technical sides of things. So if you can sort of augment your change specific training with operational and or technology focus, that's a really powerful combination and a highly effective combination in my opinion.
Gotcha. And when it comes to that, I think that's a really important piece of understanding both sides of it, because often some of our most effective change management practitioners are also operational specialists too. One thing that I would recommend is we recently have our 2023 report for digital transformation that's on our website. It has a whole organizational change section, so maybe start by reading that. That's always helpful to be able to kind of get that information.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. And that is a great resource. If you just want a primer that you could start right
Mhm.
now as we're talking, you can go to our website and download that guide to change management.
Yeah.
Also, there's the comment too that is worth clarifying that I just showed a moment ago, but from Hatem on LinkedIn, he says Cotter does not provide certifications. It's an important clarification that Cotter does not provide certifications. You can read his stuff, you can follow his frameworks, follow his approach, but I don't know of any training courses that focus on Cotter. A lot of people just refer to that framework. But as far as certification, ProSci does provide sort of a course and a certification behind it.
Mhm. And great webinars. I always join their weekly webinars. They're just a great resource in general when it comes to this types of information. So let's get to these questions from Chris and Eva on LinkedIn. They kind of have the same sort of question of how do you have a conversation with execs who have factored in only a technical budget for transformation? How much of that budget percentage does change management add? And then Eva kind of generalizes, how do you convince upper management about the need to start the change management process early? So, talking about this executive conversation and budgets and then prioritization around change management, how do you have that conversation with an executive group?
Well, I think the I'll answer the second part of the question first, and which will lead to the answer to the first one. But by convincing the way to convince the executive team is oftentimes to think about their language. What language are they speaking, and what language is going to be most effective with them? And different organizations have different answers, and you have different leadership styles and whatnot. But most organizations that we work with at the executive level, they're not super excited necessarily about this sort of a perceived nice to
Mhm.
have thing
Mhm.
like change management. They also aren't super excited about something that's perceived as really fluffy or kumbaya focused.
Mhm.
We're all sitting around holding hands and feeling good about each other. That generally tends not to resonate very well with executives if they have that perception. So really, the way I always try to view it is to speak their language. Why are you doing this project? First of all, why are you investing in technology? If you start by asking that question, oftentimes you start to scratch the surface. You start to get
Mhm.
answers like, well, our old systems are outdated. We can't grow the company, or our vendor is sunsetting the product. We've got to put in some new technology, or we've got one programmer that knows how to knows our system, and we can't be dependent on one person anymore. So we need a sort of an off-the-shelf system to help us get to the future. So you start there, and then that's sort of the superficial answer typically. And then you start to dig underneath that and say, well, what do you want this organization to look like after you go through this technology deployment? And you sort of force the executives to think of this not just as a technology upgrade, but more, what is it we're trying to accomplish as a business? And then once you get to that point, you're starting to dig down below the surface. Then you start to say, well, let's talk about what that impact to the organization is going to be. And you sort of have to start to unpack and paint a picture of what the impact to the organization is going to be. And that when you focus on the business value and the measurable results that executives expect to see out of a transformation, whether it's, net business benefits or whether it's just sort of what they want their business model to be in that future state, or both, then you start to connect the dots for them and say change management is the key to help us get there. It's not the technology. The technology alone will not help us get there. It gives us a base to work from, but the change management is what connects the dots between the technology that we deploy and the business result and that future state vision that the executives have. And usually once you do that, then, it's not easy, but you sort of have to translate this all for executives so they see and connect the dots with why change management is so important and how it fits into a digital transformation. Now I already forgot the second part of the question, something about the budget.
Yeah, the budget piece of that. And I think that's the challenge. And I do think that's evolving, because we do have clients that are, $1 million plus change management clients that come to us for that service. So that is something that I think executives are more aware of, especially with COVID, and understanding the importance of changing through a forced transformation or hijack transformation. But it is important to understand that change management does need a budget. It does need hard data, and it does need KPIs. So can you kind of teach us a little bit about how you have that conversation with executives and allocating money and resources for these types of initiatives?
Yeah, I guess just to start at the high level, sort of a ballpark, back of the envelope sort of number. And I think ProSci might have published this data point, but I remember seeing somewhere from some change resource that's credible, and I know that's super vague and not credible of me to say. It's don't worry about it. Someone that's super credible. I think it's ProSci, but it may be someone else. But there's a study that shows that the sort of the right level, or the appropriate level of spending for change management is about 15% of the total budget. So for every $1 million you're spending on an implementation, you start thinking about $150,000 of change management support. And that's just a sort of a hard and fast, really high level number that is going to vary from organization to organization. But you can kind of use that as a starting point, and then you back into, first of all, how big is the change? Because for some organizations, they're making such a massive change, and it's going to be such a huge impact to the organization that number might actually be a lot higher. For other organizations that are, say, younger organizations, they haven't been around as long. They don't have the baggage and the history that's harder to change and harder to evolve into what you're trying to be. Maybe it's a little bit less, but it's still going to be probably more material than most organizations realize in both cases. So I think if you start with sort of that 15% number, and then back up and look at, well, let's look at us and benchmark us to other organizations, and how much of a change are we making? Are we upgrading from an ERP system we deployed 10 years ago? We're just upgrading to a newer version. That's a pretty material change, but that's not as material as the organization that's using a green screen, a custom developed mainframe solution that was developed back in the 80s. And now they're trying to go to a multi-tenant cloud solution. I mean, that's a huge jump. And so that second example is probably going to spend more than 15%, or they probably should spend more than 15% of their effort on change management. This sort of ties back to the executive question too. The first part of the executive question of how do you convince executives? I tend to like to use sort of the, and I don't know if you know this, Kyler, I think we've talked about it before on this podcast, but there's a book called Love and Logic for Parenting.
Oh yeah.
You must be familiar with that as a parent.
Oh, yeah, obviously. Yeah. That's a baseline to understanding how to parent. It's a Bible, if you will. Yeah.
Yeah. So when I first met my wife, or I shouldn't say when I first met her, when I first realized that we were probably going to get married, she had kids, I didn't. So I'd never been a parent. So that was the first thing I did, is I read Love and Logic to figure out, what the heck I was going to do as a parent, because I had no idea what I was doing. And Sometimes I still don't, but that's it's a whole nother story. But the reason I bring up love and logic is that's sort of like how you have to be with executives. You have to sort of give them choice. And for those that don't know, love and logic is about choices and consequences and letting kids feel like they're in control in some way, but also showing what the consequences and the options are. And that's the same thing with executives. You have to give them options. So in the examples I had, the big extreme example from green screen to multi-tenant cloud versus the more incremental change, a lot of times when organizations or executives say, well, we don't want to invest in change management, or change management isn't going to be important, then you sort of force them into a decision of, okay, we don't have to invest that heavily in change management. Yeah. Maybe we don't want to invest 15, 20, 25% of our budget in change management. Then what we need to do if we want to be effective is we need to throttle back on our expectations of how much we're really going to change. And so maybe we pursue more of an incremental, more targeted change approach. And you sort of give them that choice. You can't have both. You can't have the big, massive change and a super cheap, thin change management budget. At least you can't have both if you want to be successful.
Right.
So you let them choose, and then it becomes their project. They're sort of setting the vision and the expectation for the project, and then ultimately that helps you define a change strategy that best aligns with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you hit on something really important, is understanding that subculture and the overall psychology of your executive team. Some systems have some organizations have a really rigid executive team that's really data focused. So you need to break these out and saying these are all the different scenarios from data points and measurements. Some are very culturally focused. So you want to do more of that qualitative analysis when it comes to change management. But either way, we talk a lot about the marriage of organizational change management and communication along with psychology practices. And recently with another, mom in digital transformation here, we did a change management TikTok series where we were in the car with our kids. And we talked about like how I have 2 toddlers. So, we talked about things like misaligning expectations and all of those things while the kids and dogs were in the back just running around. But I do think that it does go into a lot of life type of humanizing. I think Hatem said in our comments here about remembering that your executive panel or steering committee, when it comes to digital transformation, they're people too. They want this to be successful. Everyone wants this to be successful. So aligning on that. So don't let that, right here, don't let that upper management intimidate you. Be able to have that conversation so that you can set that baseline for success. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And I know Hatem also said what you had up a little bit earlier is Gartner recommends 15% minimum of overall budget. So that seems to be, the benchmark there. So.
See, I told you it was someone credible. I knew it was, even if it wasn't pro. I knew it was someone that has a credible organization that said it.
Yeah. And we have a lot of, former Gardner staff members here at Third Stage that do our consulting. So we use a lot of their great information and resources as well when it comes to advising our clients. So I want to kind of dig into more of those data points. What are some of the KPIs that you should be measuring when it comes to change management or setting as an ongoing measurement? Because we know change management is a journey. It's not, it starts in January and ends in March, those types of things. So I want to ask you that, Eric. And then I also want to hear from our audience. If you can pop in the comments, about what you think would be some of the main key performance metrics to measure, or key performance indicators for KPIs for change management. We'd love to kind of have you join that conversation too. So Eric, what are your thoughts on measuring change management?
Yeah, so I see it as a couple different layers. One is sort of the the high level outcome focused KPI. So in other words, what is it that the overall transformation is trying to accomplish, or what is the impact of the organization? So it could be, you going back to your business case and looking at, the inventory reductions that you expect to see, or the efficiency gains, or the reduced cycle times. Those are very directly related to change management, or at least they should be. And your change management strategy and plan should focus on how are we going to enable those metrics that we've defined in our business case, or sort of the justification for why we're doing this project. So very important, high level strategic business outcome focused metrics are one layer. Then the other layer below that is more the execution focused
Right.
KPIs that you measure during the transformation to see, make sure you're on track to achieve those bigger picture value focused metrics. So this would be things like user adoption levels. As you go through the initial training, how have people actually adjusted to this new technology? Are they ready for the implementation? You start to look at things like what percentage of jobs have actually been defined and communicated to the organization, and you start to measure sort of the health of the organizational change efforts. Not just to say that too many times the organizational change teams focus on the wrong metrics. They focus on metrics like, well, we held 20 different change impact workshops, and that was our goal, was to have 20 of them. Well, was that the right number? We don't know. Should you have had 50 of them? You might need less. You might need more. The more important thing is, do people understand the change? And so you start to measure the outcomes that are happening during the project rather than the activities or the inputs into the process.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one of the problems with change management is we focus on the wrong things. We measure all the stuff we did. We don't measure the outcome of what resulted from all the things we did, because you might be doing the wrong things. And that's the other thing with change management too, just as a side note, is that there's a huge change management is a huge discipline. There's so many different things you can do. And in a perfect world, yes, you would do them all and you would invest really heavily in all these different sub work streams and activities. But the reality is organizations have limited time and resources. You can't get to it all. So you have to prioritize based on who you are as an organization and what you're trying to accomplish. And you focus on a more prescriptive and maybe a little bit more surgical targeted way of change to make sure you hit the really high value stuff. And so in those cases, or in any case, you want to make sure that those are the right things you're doing, that you're getting the results during the project that will then lead to the results you expect longer term as a business.
Absolutely. And I think you hit on something that is a key issue a lot of times with traditional change management, is that it is not a measurement that just happens once or twice. It's a measurement that's continuous across the organization. And we actually had one of our guests here on transformation ground control was from Lockheed Martin, the head of HR, and he taught us that you can measure trust within an organization and the overall impact of organizational change through attrition and retention. Are people staying in their jobs? Are they, creating loyalty within the organization? Are they content and happy? And a lot of times that can be an overall baseline for change management. And that leads me to my next question, and then I'll definitely get to some of these other inputs from our audience here, because they're great information. Is what is the relationship between change management, effective change management, and company culture?
Yeah, so somewhat related to the previous question, which is, culture is the outcome or the output that you're trying to affect. You have two things you're working with. One is your current culture, the good, the bad, the ugly. You probably have some strengths in your current culture, but you probably have some things you're trying to change or some things that aren't going to support you longer term. But then the other part of that is, what is it we want our culture to be? And being very clear and deliberate about that change. And also being realistic that you're not going to change this culture. If you're a 100-year-old organization, you're going to change that culture in a 2-3 year digital transformation. You might start to bend the needle. You might start to move the needle in the right direction, but you're not going to change the culture overnight. But change management efforts and initiatives should focus on starting to bend the culture and push the culture a certain direction. You don't want to break it, in other words. And you're, even if you try, all you're going to do is create other problems if you do try to break it or change it too quickly. So I'm sorry, repeat the question again. Sort of what is the I know it's something to do with culture.
You're answering it. Yeah. So the relationship between change management and company culture, because I think a lot of times one of the misses when it comes to change management tactics and initiatives, strategies, is the ability of the culture and the readiness of the organization to go through these types of change initiatives, and being able to measure that, understand it, and really be mindful of it. Because I think a lot of times we go into these executive conversations And because that's not their day to day in interacting with their greater workforce, they may say, oh, yeah, we have no problem with change, but there's no data around that. There was no surveys done, there was no readiness assessment to really showcase, are you ready for this change, or are you setting yourself up for failure, spending a ton of money and then not having any sort of high user adoption rate or a disrupt within your organization?
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. And I also have as a caveat or a disclaimer, I am not a morning person at all. And so we record these live streams early, fairly early in the morning U.S. time. So my brain's only at like 60% capacity. So that's why I tend to forget some of these questions, but I'm glad that we're at least staying on track. You're keeping me on track. So thank
Yeah,
you.
don't worry, I'm here for you. I actually thought about this last night as I was watching Jurassic Park with my son. And of course, I am always thinking about change management and the pop culture references to that. So within Jurassic World, if you've seen it, they create this new hybrid dinosaur that's super scary. And there's this scene where the executive goes in to see this dinosaur, right? And the his assistant said, it's very scary. Do you think it's going to scare the kids at the Jurassic Park theme park? And he said, I think it's going to give their parents nightmares. And she said, is that a good thing? And he said, yes, the scarier the better. So obviously within that, there's not an alignment when it comes to business objectives. Are we here to scare or entertain people? And that wasn't thought through from a change management and business alignment strategy, because ultimately this dinosaur gets out and you can see what happens from there. Just terrorizes the theme park and the entire business goes under. So to kind of sum that up from a pop culture reference, if you don't think through what the impacts of a change to your organization and your business strategies is going to look like, and you're not aligned on that, it's going to be a dinosaur running through your theme park and completely, ruining your entire business. So
Right. But not in a cool Jurassic Park entertaining sort of a
well,
way.
I mean, I don't know that it was cool for anyone actually involved in being chased by the dinosaur, but no one thought through those types of issues. What was going to happen if you completely change the overall mindset and structure of your business. So I'm always thinking about change management, even when I'm watching, a movie with my kids about dinosaurs. So
Who
let's
doesn't? I mean,
yeah, right, right. Let's get to and don't even get me on the system side, because if they had a system that really managed those, and my family's like, please stop. It's a movie. Okay, it's a movie.
yeah. We're just trying to eat dinner and enjoy the movie,
Yeah,
Mom. Can you
like,
please just stop
yeah,
working?
exactly. Exactly. But let's get to some of these really good uh, feedback here from the overall audience. So I know Gerald said some tips is aligning employee KPIs, which we kind of just talked about on the scary dinosaur side. Performance to digital transformation, easier said than done. So what's your gut reaction to that easier said than done type of thing? And how do you set that expectation when it comes to helping clients through the organizational change, employee KPI, and performance process?
Well, I guess I would challenge that statement a little bit. I first of all, I agree that it's easier said than done, but I might disagree with whether or not it should be easier said than done. And the reason I say that is because I think the reason it is difficult for organizations to set those clear metrics and connect the dots between the change management efforts and what the actual business outcomes are they're trying to accomplish is because the organization itself and the executive team themselves don't have a clear vision of what it is they want. And that's to me, that's the root cause is you don't have alignment, you don't have clarity, you don't have a sense of vision and direction. And if you don't have that, then yes, it's going to be very difficult to set metrics. You're going to have a lot of confusion and disagreement as to what those metrics should be, how important they are, whether or not they, connect the dots with what you're trying to accomplish as an organization, because you haven't taken that time up front to clearly state what the vision is, what the goals and objectives of the project are, what you want to be when you grow up. The organizations that have that clear vision have a lot easier time connecting those dots. And so so then the easier said than done comment is less relevant to them because they have taken the time to define that. So I think you have to get to the root cause of that. It's setting the KPIs is relatively easy if you have that clarity. But the problem is most organizations don't have that clarity vision. They don't have alignment. They haven't thought through what they want this project to be and what they want to be when they grow up.
So say that they have, for the sake of that on the executive side, they have a very polished PowerPoint deck that talks about the pillars of their business, their future goals, those types of things. But often it stops there. It's not communicated or practiced, I would say, within the rest of the organization. How can you make sure that you set your clients up for a communication plan around this change that's going to be effective and that's not going to provide any, type of resistance within the business? And if it does, how do you address that?
Yeah. So I think first of all, you have to be real and
Mhm.
pragmatic about what you're trying to accomplish. I think, you and I talk about buzzwords on the podcast all the time, and our shared love in a
Mhm.
facetious way, or
I truly do love buzzwords. I
oh,
love
do,
them.
do
And
you?
I'm
I
not
love making
I'm not
fun of them.
yeah,
I just like
right.
to poke fun at it. But the reason I bring it up is because here's the dynamic that plays out, and here's why. I think this will answer your question. We sort of
Mhm,
show a illustration of what happens in the marketplace. Someone at an organization decides that they need new technology for whatever reason. Their
mhm,
system's outdated. They want to scale. Whatever. There's a million different reasons why you might want new technology. You start reaching out to software vendors and sales reps and system integrators and implementation technical partners, and they all start using these buzzwords like we're going to future proof your business. That's the one. I cannot stand that term. What in the world does that mean? We're going to future proof your business, or we're going to rethink the art of the possible. Okay, that doesn't mean
oh,
anything
I've
to
never
anyone.
heard of that one before.
Oh gosh, don't get me started. There's so many like lame buzzwords and lame sales tactics. They're highly
Mhm,
effective, I have to say.
mhm.
They're in their defense. But the organizations sort of buy into that. They just think, okay, we're going to future proof our business. Okay, well, what does that mean? Like, you're going to future proof. Well, we're going to be more nimble and agile. Okay, what does that mean? Like, what in the world does that mean? And what are the metrics behind that? And how are we actually going to transform the business? So I think that's the key, is to really get below, all the buzzwords and the noise, and get to your business and who you are and what you're trying to be, and really setting those metrics in that way. And first and foremost, more importantly, setting the direction with all of your executive team, your key stakeholders, and making sure they're all on the same page. Because a lot of times what happens is they're not on the same page with what this project means and what the priorities are and how they're going to declare victory
Mhm.
and all that stuff. They're just sort of using or parroting back the sales language, like future proof and agile and art of the possible, all that sort of garbage that gets spouted in our industry. So I don't know if that answers your question at
Yeah,
all, but
yeah. Well, speaking of garbage that gets in our industry, I think I don't know if it's Kevin or Kevon here on LinkedIn, but he has a pretty long comment, which I really encourage everyone to kind of read. But he kind of talks about, to summarize, that a lot of times the issues that organizations come into with change management is through ERP system vendors and saying, hey, we have this template, we have this best practice around change management, specifically with our system. Don't worry about it. We got it. And that's a lot of times where we're called in third stage as an organization, because that's not effective. They have a job that they're very good at. It's implementing, selling software and managing that system. And we know from having to come into triage organizations when they spend a bunch of other money to get their project back on track because their ERP vendor has led them kind of down the wrong path when it comes to change management. So I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that, because that's kind of a sweet spot we have here in third stage. Unfortunately, right? We never want to go into a business and in that situation, but it happens all the time.
yeah, yeah. And I think you have to just, back up and look at the human dynamics and human nature. I mean, you have software vendors, system integrators, people that are focused on a single technology, and they're not necessarily interested in telling you all the things that are wrong with the software or all the risks of deploying the
Mhm.
technology. That's generally not a good sales tactic, right? Is to say, oh, well, our product's going to create all these problems for you. It's going to create all these risks. It's going to be a change management nightmare for you. That's usually not what organization or what sales reps are going to lead with. They're going to lead with,
Oh,
look at
sure.
all this cool stuff that the technology does. So, it's understandable why they have this blind spot around change management. And then, usually they'll pay some lip service to change management because most people recognize that we need change management. But the problem is, back to our earlier points, not enough people understand what change management really is. So then the sales reps, the software vendors, the implementers, they'll sort of pay a little bit of lip service to change management by saying, oh, yeah, we do change management. We'll help you train. We'll train the trainer. We'll train you how to use the technology. We'll help you put together a communications plan. Well, that's just a tiny, tiny piece of what change management is. And by the way, that's just a real superficial, tactical based view of change management. You haven't gotten into the heart of change management, things like what is the change impact? What is that future state organizational design? How are reporting relationships going to change? Roles and responsibilities. You have to get to that stuff, which, by the way, has really not a lot to do with technology, other than the fact that the technology does influence and does affect how people's jobs are going to change. But defining roles and responsibilities and the future state organization and the operating model, those are largely business decisions, not technology decisions. So it's understandable that they wouldn't focus on that. But organizations go to the software vendors and the sales reps as the experts. They're the ones that understand the technology, and they defer too much to the software vendors without really not poking holes, but really just thinking outside the box of, okay, software vendors good at deploying technology, but now I've got to figure out how to address this change stuff. How do I do all the things I just mentioned? Define the future state organization, define the future state operating model, all that.
Absolutely. And I think that one key message of understanding the bias in that conversation is that's not a negative thing, right? It is what it is within any sort of organization. If you have someone from accounting that's on your steering committee, they're obviously going to have a bias of the accounting processes and technology. That's not a negative thing. It's the same with ERP vendors. As they come in, their job is to make this streamlined for you to sell their software. And then once you implement it, they kind of fade into the abyss. It's not often an ongoing partnership, though sometimes it can be. But that's why it's important to have that independent, technology agnostic business advisor on your side saying, okay, that's all great, well, and good with the software side, but we need to understand what you need for your organization for this to be successful. And that's not a template from a software vendor. It would be like trying to fit clothes. Not all clothes fit a specific human body, and that's just how it is, right? But you need to buy the clothes that fit you, that you like, that matches your style. It's the same with organizational change management plans. It needs to fit the organization, not the ERP vendor. So definitely an important conversation. And I love Hatim's comment here: garbage in, garbage stay. That's so true and very sustained. Very, very clear. So I like that a lot. Definitely.
Yeah, keep the garbage out of your transformation if you can.
Yeah.
It's gonna just
Right. Absolutely.
be more focused on your operations and your business, and you have to get past all the garbage, because there is a lot of garbage in this space. Not just sales reps; it's also just the technology itself. There's just so many bells and whistles and things that organizations aren't realistically going to use. You don't need it. It's not a priority. So don't complicate the transformation just because the vendor wants to sell you more software.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I'll harp home, and it's not even on the third stage sales side. Of course, we'd love to help you, but understanding that this isn't something you don't know what you don't know, and that's exactly right. We talk about the house scenario and metaphor. You wouldn't go into your new house and put in all the plumbing, could you? Maybe, I don't know, but you would call probably a plumber to ensure from that insurance standpoint that you do it correctly, because you want to be able to take a shower, to drink water, all of those different things within your house effectively. And that's what having that independent consultant in this space, because they can identify those red flags, which brings me to my next question, is what are some red flags that your organization change management is on track for failure?
Great question. Well, some of the leading indicators would be, first of all, if you haven't started change management yet, no matter where you are in the project, if you've started the project at any point and you haven't really dug into this change management work stream, that's a huge red flag, and you need to get on that as soon as possible. In fact, to the point where if you need to slow down and push off some of the technology stuff and get ahead of the change management thing, that's going to be a lot more effective for you, and time and money much better spent. So that's one, is if you don't have, if you haven't started the change management stuff, if you haven't done any sort of organizational assessment yet, that would be a place to start. Do that organizational assessment. We have a process we use at third stage where it's sort of a two-prong approach. One is a quantitative web-based survey analytical tool. The other one's more of a qualitative focus group aspect. And you put that together to really get a lay of the land to understand where the challenges and risks are. You benchmark to other organizations and you put together the change strategy and plan from there and you start executing. If you haven't done that stuff yet, you want to start that now. Again, if you have to push off the technology stuff to get to that, then I would do that. The other thing too is, the other red flag or another symptom of lack of change management would be, one is if like your executive team is not aligned and this is just a qualitative thing. This is hard to measure. We have ways that we dig into this and uncover it. But if you as an organization sense that your executive team's not on the same page or they have unrealistic expectations or they just don't fully understand what this project is or they can't articulate what this project really means to the organization, that's a big red flag. And then another one that usually comes a little bit later in the project, and this is a big red flag, is if you see that the project team and the subject matter experts, the stakeholders, are pushing for more customization of the technology or technologies that are being deployed. Every organization, for the most part, has some degree of customization they're going to have to do to the technology. But the ones that take it to the extreme, oftentimes that's a symptom of the fact that they're not managing change well. And change management and customization, to me, it's almost like a seesaw. Like if you're not investing in change management, customization is probably going to go up, and that's going to create a bunch of other problems. If you invest more in change management, that's going to sort of balance that out and push down the need or the want to customize. Not 100%, because you're still going to have to customize because no software is perfect. No software aligns perfectly with what you're trying to accomplish. So those are a few, maybe 3 symptoms that I'd watch for to start would be, the high customization, lack of alignment or clarity from your executive team, and then not having started change management early in the project.
Absolutely. And I think those are all really, really important red flags to monitor and understand and continue to assess throughout your organization, analyze what that's looking like from a qualitative and quantitative perspective. So to wrap up here, I'm going to ask you and I'm going to ask our audience here, can you share a case study of an organization from an autonomous perspective that didn't invest in change management and suffered the consequences of doing so, and what can happen if you don't prioritize change management strategies within a digital transformation?
Yeah, gosh, I've seen a lot of them. Probably the best case studies are the unfortunate train wreck scenarios, like the project recoveries projects and/or the expert witness work we do. A lot of our revenue as a business comes from expert witness. And that's a growing part of one of the growing parts of our business too, unfortunately. But in those expert witness cases, what I can say is we've done probably 30 to 35 cases over the last 10 or 15 years, where we've been the designated expert to testify in a lawsuit that involves a digital transformation failure. And in every single one of those cases, change management was a problem, was a root cause. And in fact, I went back recently. A couple of years ago, I went back and looked at past expert witness cases, and that's the only theme that was common across all of the cases was lack of change management. And so I could pick any one of those 35 examples, but I think probably the biggest one, the most memorable one was actually the very first expert witness case I ever did. It was a really big lawsuit. A lot of people listening right now probably have heard of this lawsuit. This was back in like 2007 or 8, I think it was. And I didn't even, honestly, at the time, this is a fun little fact, I didn't even know what an expert witness was at the time. I didn't know what that meant until an attorney called and said, hey, we saw, a blog you wrote or something. Do you do expert witness work? I said, I don't know. Tell me what an expert witness is, and I'll tell you if I can do it. Anyway, so that was the very first case where I was an expert witness, and it was a lawsuit against one of the really big ERP software vendors. And in that case, it was an organization that was trying to implement this big ERP vendor in an 18-month period. And this was a massive organization. I think their revenue was it was in the tens of billions of dollars of revenue. They're a large I can't even tell you what industry it is because it gives it away.
Yeah, yeah. We
But
don't
actually, I
need.
could probably say it. Well, no, I have confidentiality, so I can't really say it. But it's a utility of sorts, I guess I'd say. Not
Mhm,
a power or gas utility, but it's a consumer utility that we all
mhm,
use on a weekly basis to. I don't know. Again, I can't use the word without giving it away. But anyway, this company, massive company, they had like 30 different locations throughout North America, or 30 main locations, and then they had a bunch of sub locations as well.
mhm,
They're suing a big ERP vendor who comes in and says, we can do this implementation across 30 locations in 18 months, which
mhm,
right away you look at that and say, there's no way that was ever going to happen in this universe. Um, but that's the proposal they had. And then it turned into a failure. 3 years go by and they still hadn't implemented the first location. So
mhm,
they had committed to 18 months, all 30 locations. 3 years go by, they couldn't even get the one location, the first location to go live. Then they filed a lawsuit. So reason I'm kind of getting into the backdrop here is that was the outcome. That was the end result, was a big massive failure. They spent
mhm,
like 3 times the budget they expected, took twice as long, and they still didn't even get anywhere close to finishing. But then when you, as an expert witness, you get to see everything that happened in that project, everything from
mhm,
project statuses, steering committee readouts. You can see the
mhm,
code of what was being done on the technical side, the change management plans, every email that went back and forth to anyone in the organization related to that project. You get
mhm,
access to all these emails. You learn way too much about people that you don't necessarily need or want to know. But one of the things we did learn in our sort of forensic analysis of
mhm,
this train wreck was that the organization at the top, the executive level, was just a mess. It was a really highly
mhm,
political organization. There's a lot of backstabbing and infighting. They couldn't agree on whose fault this was and what they were trying to
mhm,
be. And again, it pointed at change management because that right there at the top level was a sign that this project was never going to succeed. It didn't
mhm,
matter what vendor was involved. This project was not going to succeed because
mhm,
that company was such a mess. And I don't know that, honestly, I don't know that any amount of change management could have fixed how broken this organization was,
mhm.
and maybe they still are. But they didn't invest any sort of effort in change management, and so that's probably the biggest case study or the most extreme case study that I
Yeah.
can think of. And so you end up with all these really unhealthy dynamics where everyone's throwing each other under the bus. Project gets delayed. They start pointing fingers. They're firing people left and right, but it still doesn't fix anything. It gets to the point where you read all these emails and I remember feeling really bad for the people that were on this project because they were just set
Yeah.
up for failure.
Yeah.
Not just because of change management. There's other stuff too, of course.
Absolutely, yeah, and it sounds like we've got some similar experience here in the comments. Hatem said underestimating scale and scope of change management, neglected stakeholders, which you're kind of talking about, poor communication. Again, and active resistance and active silos, and that can often be the hardest thing to kind of unearth, especially as a project leader, because you really have to get granular and open that door to transparency on that feedback loop, or you won't even know that resistance exists until it's really too late.
Right.
um, and then Chris also on LinkedIn said, my experience wasn't that there was no change management, but the executives didn't understand the role. The change manager was inexperienced and ended up doing all sorts of roles that they should have been nowhere near. And that can happen too, especially in not understanding the culture or not being honest about the culture, I think is the biggest thing. It's not a bad thing to say, like, hey, our culture isn't exactly built for this type of large change. We have a very entrepreneurial cowboy culture, and that's how we've gotten to this high growth. But we don't have any standardization. We don't really have, we have a ton of tribal knowledge. That's fine. It's better to be aware and say that up front so that you can better set yourself up for success, as opposed to, saying that you're going to be a perfect culture for new technology because you're an innovator. And sometimes being an innovator, and that's why Eric and I work here, isn't always a great thing on the, on the standardization side.
Right.
So it's not a bad thing to say, that that's something that you might interact with within your change management strategies. So with that, any final thoughts or some number one best practices that you'd recommend for our audience here on the change management side or understanding the impact for their organization?
Sure. So I'd say the first thing is that if I were to sort of leave some closing thoughts, one is that change management is almost always more difficult, and change in general is almost always more difficult than organizations and project teams realize. That's one. Um, Secondly, is start change management as soon as possible. The sooner you start, the better. Change management is usually on the critical path to completion of a transformation. In other words, if it's usually the longest duration activity in a project plan, the technology stuff is usually one of the shorter work streams. So the sooner you start on the change management, the sooner you're going to start your project, the more effective it's going to be, the cheaper you're going to implement. So that 15% metric we shared earlier, you may spend 15% on change management, but you're probably going to save a lot more than that in mitigating or avoiding those overruns and the problems that result from not having invested in change management. And then the third thing I'd say is this is more of a tip to just get started, because I know change management is such a broad, big thing. It means a lot of different things. And just understanding the magnitude of change at your organization can be very difficult. You can
Yeah.
start simple. You don't need to take a shotgun approach and just go start doing a bunch of change management stuff. Start by doing an organizational assessment wherever you are in the project. Do the assessment of where you are now, where you're trying to get, where the organizational pitfalls are, and then create a change strategy and plan that really prioritizes the most important things for you to do. And there might be some things you don't get to, some of the lower priority stuff, but at least you've hit on the highest priority change management stuff. So start small with that assessment, and that's going to give you a lot more clarity and direction on how you would approach change management. And of course, us at Third Stage, we specialize in this stuff. It's where I started my career. It's where a lot of us started our careers at Third Stage. So this is something that we do either as part of an implementation that we're supporting, or in some cases, as you mentioned, Kyler, we have some clients that hire us just to do the change management stuff, starting with that organizational assessment.
Absolutely. And hopefully, we can create some excitement and positivity around just the exercise of getting to know your organization, especially on an executive level. There is nothing more important than really researching what you become. And even if you're the CEO and founder and you built it from the ground up, that's great. But you have an entirely new workforce that you now have an opportunity to not only enhance from new technology, create growth and be more efficient, but you also have the opportunity to really get to know your organization and point the compass from a cultural standpoint to where you want to be or what you want to do. And that takes that knowledge is power approach through those granular assessments that you just mentioned. So thank you so much for joining us today. I know Eric mentioned that this will be in our ground control podcast. We always love change management. If you're watching this after the fact, we do come back and answer all of the comments. So feel free to engage with that conversation. But this will be packaged for our ground control that comes out every Wednesday. Next week, we also have our Digital Stratosphere podcast, which last week we talked about the migration from QuickBooks with our small business team. And this week we'll be talking about functional architecture on our Friday morning live stream. So feel free to join us on Third Stage channels to meet some more of our team there. But thank you, Eric, for all this great insight and answering all of our awesome questions from the audience today.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the great questions. And thank you to the audience for great conversation. A lot of them we didn't get to, but I appreciate I'm reading them. We've read them all, and we'll comment even after the fact. So thank you to everyone for your great comments and questions there too. We, like Kyler said, we do these live streams weekly on Tuesdays, same time, same place, LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter. So be sure to check us out on those platforms. And every Wednesday, check out Transformation Ground Control. So tomorrow, a new episode will come out on YouTube, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, as well as any of the audio podcast platforms that you might listen to podcasts on. So be sure to check it out. It's called Transformation Ground Control. So thanks for being part of that show, even if you didn't realize that you're going to be part of the show. That's what this live stream is used for. So thank everyone for your time. We'll look forward to seeing you next time. Have a great week in the meantime, and we will see you all soon. Take care.